Gentlemen, this month's masterclass for men is called Understanding and Decoding Women, and you do not want to miss it. If you're listening to this podcast within a couple days of it dropping, go ahead and go to mountaintoppodcast.com/masterclass to grab your ticket. The live event is on Wednesday night, March 29th, and I look forward to seeing you there. mountaintoppodcast.com/masterclass.
Live from the mist-enshrouded mountaintop fortress that is X and Y Communications headquarters, you're listening to the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. And now, here's your host, Scott McKay.
All right, gentlemen, welcome yet again to another episode of the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. My name is Scott McKay, at Scott McKay on YouTube and on Twitter and on Truth Social and just about everywhere else except Instagram, where I'm at Real Scott McKay. The website is mountaintoppodcast.com, and gentlemen, we, as always, invite you to join our happy and thriving men's group on Facebook called the Mountaintop Summit. All right, guys, buckle up, because with me today for the third time is my good friend and yours, Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, who is, pretty much without question, the world expert on blind spots and cognitive biases. And even though he talks very scientifically about these things, the nature of how our brains work and how we interact with each other can take such humorous and entertaining turns that we always get a good laugh, perhaps at the expense of social science. And I don't think today's episode will be an exception to that rule, but I think we will continue the pattern, because what we're going to talk about is an exceptionally exciting, novel, and dare I say unique topic that Gleb himself brought up, which is the idea of us as men having to really relearn in many ways how to lead and how to be social, especially with women, because like it or not, we live in a remote world nowadays. Everything isn't face to face. A lot of what we do is virtual. And, like most things in life, gentlemen, if we don't adapt, we're not going to thrive. So without anything further, Gleb Tsipursky from Ohio, welcome, my friend. Welcome back.
Thank you, Scott. It's great to be back for my third time. It's really fun to have our conversations.
Yeah. And, I know you talk with business leaders a lot. And getting you to come on the show and interact with these guys who are mostly interested in getting better with women, improving their dating lives, improving their relationships, I'm sure is a bit of a flex for you, but I think it's also a lot of fun, indeed, for both of us. And, here's the spoiler alert. We were actually talking about this before we clicked record on the show, because so much of what you talk about in the business world, especially as you interface with C-level guys who are trying to sort this whole issue we just mentioned out of working remote and leading remotely, a lot of those issues really do kind of circle back to our lives with women and dating and relationships and these video dates over Zoom that we were asked to have during COVID and, well, dare I say, online dating and apps in general, right?
They are indeed. And men have not been doing great at online dating for a very long time. I think the pandemic has just brought this into light and also brought attention from me and others to how to address all of these problems that men have in both working remotely, but also dating remotely and socializing remotely and thinking about our world, what our world will look like. We're thinking about things like remote work. You and I were chatting before the show about ChatGPT, what the future is like. We're increasingly getting disrupted by technology. And we need to know how to function within this increasingly technologically mediated world where we are mediated, our relationships are mediated by technology if we have a hope of surviving and thriving the way we want as men in the future.
Yeah, indeed. And you know what, Gleb, before we go any further, tell these guys the name of the new book you've written specifically on this subject.
Sure, happy to. So the book is called Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams, a manual on benchmarking to best practices for competitive advantage. And folks can find it on Amazon, elsewhere. Just Google it.
Well, hold on. What I'm going to actually do, gentlemen, is put that right at the top of my Amazon influencer queue. So it'll be right there in the bookstore for you at mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon. When you're done with the show, you can grab your copy of it. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So that'll be great. And I look forward to talking about the book.
All right. Okay. So there you go. So you haven't only been writing books about this. You've been actually consulting. I'm wondering if it's face to face or virtually or a hybrid of the two, because you like that term too, that hybrid socialization model. But you actually have been doing interpersonal coaching with business leaders on this subject.
Yeah, indeed. I've done 22 organizations by now. And I would say 95% of my interactions have been virtual, so virtual consulting. Yeah, there are some clients who I never met, especially early on in the pandemic, and some clients who I flew out just for really important meetings. But yeah, 95% of the time it was all virtual, and I helped them transition to figuring out their permanent long-term hybrid work and remote work arrangements.
Now, as you talk to these leaders, obviously a lot of them are men, and one of the things you talked about in your book is how in the business world, a lot of people really, if you get them to opine anonymously, what they'll tell you is I prefer staying at home and working and not necessarily coming into the office every day of the week, maybe 2 or 3 days a week, maybe not at all. And a lot of the male leaders in particular have, kind of a cocktail of biases and blind spots that you have names for that make them think, no, that can't possibly be true. I love coming into work. This is a lot more productive and everybody else is going to love this too. But those leaders have been forced to they've been forced to rethink this. So talk about some of those biases that we as guys tend to have about what we've got set up and it works, so why change it, and how that might apply to us, in a world where our relationships with women are starting out more and more virtually also. Go ahead and talk about that.
Sure, happy to. So one of the biggest challenges, whether it's for dating or for leading or for working, is called the status quo bias. The status quo bias. Now, this is all part of the context. These are all mental blind spots, cognitive biases. That's the scientific term for them, cognitive biases. They come from a combination of how our brain is wired and our evolutionary environment. So evolutionarily, we evolved for the ancient savanna. When we lived in small tribes of 50 people to 150 people, we had to rely on the fight or flight reflex. And as a result, we have a number of inbuilt problematic decision-making patterns, and these are called cognitive biases. One of the biggest challenges is called the status quo bias, where we tend to have a preference for what we perceive as the status quo, even though the situation changed, and going back to the status quo, whatever it was before the situation changed, would not give us the actual results that we want. Now, think about the savanna environment. It was very precarious, very dangerous, and it wasn't really changing much. It was just the changing of the season, spring, summer, fall, winter. So we have a tendency, if there's a change in the environment, to try to bring it back to our previous environmental situation. Here in the modern world, that's a bad idea. Think about the 2008-2009 fiscal crisis, or the rise of the smartphone, or the pandemic. These developments fundamentally disrupted our world. They changed us. So trying to go back to the past is a problematic tendency. Same thing. It applies very much to remote work, to remote dating, to virtual socialization. There's a tendency by men, by leaders, to try to go back to what we know. And here's the thing. What we know is what we're comfortable with. We feel good about it. And so our gut reaction is to tell us to go and do these things that we feel good about. It's the topic of our previous conversation on going with your gut. So this is something that we should really be avoiding, because our gut does not necessarily lead us to the outcomes that we want. It leads us to the status quo bias and a number of other blind spots. So thinking about the status quo bias, there are a number of leaders who feel that, hey, I know how to be successful in the office. I know how to manage my team. I know how to run the company. I know how to lead people. And there are a number of men who, even in lower level roles, who feel like, okay, I know how to be successful when I'm in the office. so managers and so on, and who are therefore trying to make their employees come to the office because they know how to succeed in the office. And the challenge with that is that if you give people an option, there's a McKinsey survey. So McKinsey is a large consulting firm, does quite effective surveys. It found that 87% of people who have a remote capable job, who can work remotely, they would rather work remotely much or all of the time compared to the 13% of the people who would want to come to the office on the old status quo Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. So you're not really going to have very good retention or recruitment or employee engagement or productivity if you force people to come to the office. And those are really the business goals that we are pursuing in business settings: retention, productivity, recruitment, engagement. And that's in the office. The same thing applies to dating. There are lots and lots of men who are thinking of, well, now that the pandemic is quote unquote over, of course, it's not over. I just had COVID in late December and still not fully recovered. But anyway, the pandemic is on the way to becoming more endemic. And so men are thinking, well, let me just go back to the old dating style that I am used to and go to that old dating life. But that's not the way that you will succeed in the new world that is increasingly intermediated by technology, where the technology mediates our social relations to people. You need to learn how to date effectively in a remote setting. You need to learn how to interact and be romantic in a remote setting using technology if you want to succeed with women in our increasingly disrupted world. So that's just one cognitive bias. And I can go on into others, but I'm going to let you have a chance to say something, Scott.
Yeah, well, thank you. You know, you just threw a wrench in my machine without even realizing it, because as I listen to you talk about a world replete with, well, remote virtual socialization, it really isn't going to go away. It isn't a fad, okay? There's going to be online dating. There are going to be apps. There are going to be Zoom calls. And we're forever going to, well, from now on, envision this style of socialization as being, well, more real than virtual. Now, a couple of things come to mind. First of all, we had a debate on this show about whether men should really double down on getting better with their online dating skills, or the contrary view. We should actually make it such that, well, new school is actually going to be old school. People are starving for in-person interaction post-COVID, and we need to get out there and meet women. And I'll tell you what, you're smart enough, Gleb, that you basically brought both of those sides together under one umbrella in what you just described. And meanwhile, back in our episode where we talked about this at length, we both kind of ended up agreeing more than we disagreed, in that we feel like we need to kind of do both. Now, see, here's the thing. In business or in dating or with your friends and other situations, which I'll get to in a second, that I think are probably even better examples, you know, in a lot of situations, it really is true that, hey, the real in-person interaction is unquestionably better. I mean, everything else is, as AT&T used to say, the next best thing to being there. But here's the rub, man. Everybody wants it that way. They're okay with the trade-off. I mean, the convenience of being home, not commuting, maybe being able to take care of my dog and my kids on the sly, or, you know, taking a break when I want to take a break, not having somebody look over my shoulder, all that good stuff. Everybody wants that trade-off. And I think a lot of people also want the trade-off of interacting socially online with a larger number of people more frequently than actually getting in a car and going and seeing their friend, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in a work environment, that may have fewer pitfalls. And in your book, you indeed differentiate between people who are like in sales and marketing versus people who are, say, floor workers at a factory who need to literally stand there and build widgets together on an assembly line, and everybody in between. And as I would present as another example, it would be hard for the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles to have gotten together virtually on Zoom and played a football game. Those guys had to show up for work and play the darned football game, right? That's a silly example. You even chuckled as I was describing it. I would say that this whole dating relationship thing is somewhere in the middle ground there, between the marketing team at a Fortune 500 company and, you know, an NFL team having to play an actual football game. Yes, we can meet women online. We can talk to them online. We can have Zoom dates during COVID, which, by the way, were disastrous. And I'd love to have you talk about why. Okay. But you know what? If you don't ever actually meet, you can't embrace, you can't make out, you can't have sex. I mean, I suppose you could trade test tubes or something and make babies, but not really. There has to ultimately be an in-person element to it. So from a sociological perspective, I find it fascinating that people seem like they'd love to prolong that. Hey, you know, let's go ahead and have a couple more Zoom calls, or let's chit chat a little bit more through this online dating app before we meet. And I'll tell you what I think. I think people are afraid of disappointing each other. They would much rather live with the fantasy than risk the reality. And that's not something we've ever had to face back in the day. So I'd love for you to tell me if there's a name for that particular cognitive bias where I'm holding on to a fantasy rather than really embracing that reality. And also talk about how we would bridge the gap as men, I guess, from here to there in terms of the complexities and the deficiencies of being virtual versus finally meeting and relating. Go ahead and talk about both of those things.
Yeah, so I think it's very important to not think of this as a binary. And here, I think, is what's going on. So there's a cognitive bias called functional fixedness, where once we learn how to do something, we become fixed in that way of functioning. Whether it's learning how to lead people, whether it's learning how to work together, how to collaborate, how to communicate, whether it's learning how to date, how to relate, how to socialize. It's kind of like the hammer-nail syndrome. When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So when you're in person, you tend to have that approach to everything else, to the Zoom happy hours, Zoom dating. I could talk about a little bit later about Zoom dating. So this is a big problem. The hammer-nail syndrome is a very serious challenge for successful remote work, for successful remote dating. Because what I see men do, whether in dating, whether as leaders, whether as just professionals, is try to shoehorn these office-based ways of collaborating, these in-person-based ways of dating into remote settings. And that just doesn't work very well. It's kind of like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You just, knock off the corners. It just does not work very well. So what men have to realize is just thinking about what the future will look like. And the couple more Zoom dates, I don't think that it's primarily due to the desire to not disappoint. From what I've been seeing in communicating to people about work, about dating, there is an interesting new study that came out that about 33%, a third of all fully remote workers started office romance fully remotely. So clearly something is working for them, right? And we can talk about that. The crucial thing for men to realize when they're thinking about dating is that women, they are not holding off and they're not saying, let's have a couple more Zoom calls because they're afraid of disappointing the men. They are being more choosy. They're being more selective because their in-person time is more precious. They are making much fewer dates and they're doing a lot more filtering online before going on those dates. So that, I think, is the key. And I'm seeing the same. This is kind of like you're talking about the marketing team, sales team versus the Kansas City Chiefs and the Philadelphia Eagles. Yeah, I think here we're thinking about hybrid dating. So instead of fully remote, the future of dating is going to be hybrid. There's increasingly large numbers of women, especially younger women, are spending much, much more time filtering men remotely before they're going out on a date. And the pretty problematic dates is when you have Zoom happy hour dates, Zoom dates. Those have a lot of problems. And here's why. We're not really wired to connect on a Zoom video screen. We are wired to connect in person. And so when you have a Zoom video date, you don't feel as connected as you would in person. You don't feel as engaged. And so it feels worse to you and to the woman when you have that Zoom date than you would in everything else being equal than if you were in person. So there's a sense of disappointment that it didn't go as well. I don't feel as connected. I don't feel as fulfilled. I don't feel as satisfied. What's wrong? This is why Zoom dates have been really quite problematic because of our intuitive expectation of having those connections. Instead, what you should be doing is having native virtual interactions. So native virtual interactions involve...
You said native, not naked, right?
You can certainly do naked.
Okay,
I have no problem with that.
Okay.
Sure. But native virtual interactions, things that are made for the virtual world. For example, you can play a game together. So having games, not all women like games, but many do. So you can play a game together where you're on one side, you're at the other side, you chat across Discord. So have a game together where you have a collaborative game, especially a collaborative game, less of a competitive game. There are many collaborative games out there, building stuff together. You can do things that are asynchronous, game, turn-based. So games are good. You can do something like a virtual escape room. So virtual escape room is a nice activity where you go into escape room and you try to escape, and then you're forced to collaborate, and it's a bonding activity. And there are plenty of other things like this that are made for virtual interactions. Instead of having these Zoom dates, some Zoom dates are kind of inescapable, where you need to be able to converse with the other person, but you need to lower your expectations, and you need to also do other things that would help you feel more connected. And that's Zoom dating. But the crucial thing here is to avoid functional fixedness. Avoid assuming that, now everything is fine. I could just go back to the quote-unquote real world. That's bringing in the status quo bias again. So I can go back to the real world and not have to use all these skills I picked up during COVID, where some men were just very reluctantly doing technological intermediation of Zoom and apps and so on, and they couldn't wait until they can go back to the real world. But, I have news for you. Most women are not simply going back to the quote-unquote real world of 2019. They are increasingly using technology to filter out men. And so here's the trick. You need to really learn how to interact effectively remotely. And you need to learn about these cognitive biases that can cause you to have a lot of problems when interacting effectively remotely, not simply as leaders, but as daters, as romantic partners. And you also need to be especially good in person, because you have a lot fewer opportunities to make an impression. So your in-person time is going to be more precious. So in the future, our dating is going to be much more hybrid. We'll be spending a lot more time on technology, a lot less time in person, so that you need to be really good at the technology part, and you also need to be great at the in-person part. So the bar is raised in both areas.
There was a lot to talk about there, of course, because you're very smart, and man, you just unpacked a whole lot. I had in my notes a talking point that reads, we need to make the most of fewer in-person moments in life, because there are so many virtual ones. And I think you just nailed that one. I think you described that one excellently. Gleb, of course, because it's your life's work, you're so good at challenging my assumptions and my biases. I would still say there are a lot of women out there who are afraid that they're not going to be enough for a guy, and the fantasy is going to blow up in their face once they finally meet in person. Mm-hmm. Kind of the Cyrano de Bergerac fear, right? But you know what? You're putting the shoe on the proverbial other foot. Instead of a woman who perhaps is used to disappointing men, there are also women who are used to delighting men and being wanted by a high percentage of them, and they're indeed screening guys out using this digital model. Now, I would offer that that's not necessarily gender specific. I think there are plenty of guys who, when women meet them, they want to lock them down and marry them. So it could be kind of a little bit of a digital buffer for men also. But what I thought about as you were talking is even a third possibility there psychologically. And it occurred to me right as you were talking about the high percentage of people who are starting virtual online romances. Gleb, a whole lot of people just don't want the noise and the mess of actually meeting in real life and sex and pregnancy and STDs and complicated stuff. They'd much rather just have a cute little fantasy on the side, and that's enough for now. So it might be exactly what the proverbial doctor ordered in the moment. That's another possibility. I also love how you really put a clear differentiation on the table there between trying to, slam that proverbial square peg into the round hole by trying to make a Zoom date be as much like a real world date as possible. Two things there. First of all, the idea of playing an online game together or doing a virtual escape room together is something you couldn't do in person. It's uniquely something you would do online and partake of together. And therefore, because it feels native to the online world, it might actually be a better way to bond online than doing something that is ultimately going to be an unreasonable facsimile of meeting in the real world. The other thing that came to mind, and, I'll let you go on to the next point after this, but I actually feel like I have to say this. I joked with you for a little levity, a little comic relief about the word native versus naked. But, there is some truth to the fact that we lose a little bit of our inhibition when we're not actually in front of each other and there is that digital buffer. I remember even before video conferencing was really very popular, I was single and IMing with women. Man, things would get very flirty and horny a lot faster than they would in real life. And indeed, once video came into its own, people will get naked with each other on video a lot more freely than they will in person, especially if they're very remote. Like she's a few states away and the probability of meeting is relatively low. Single parents, Gleb, like if you're a single dad with a full custody of a kid and she's a single mom and neither one of you are getting out much, man, on Friday nights when everybody else who's single and, freewheeling and doesn't have any kids yet are out on dates and whatever they're doing, the single moms and dads, after they put the kids to bed, 11:30, 12 a.m., wee hours of the night, are getting naked with each other on Zoom and loving it. And it's almost like a unique venue where that sort of thing can happen. So indeed, there are lots of ways where you can do what you refer to in the book, kind of in a business context, as having a virtual water cooler instead of just trying to make the Zoom meeting feel more like a real date, so I love it. One thing I would love for you to talk about is this need to be part of something bigger than ourselves, which is a challenge when remote. And this gets to the heart of not only men and women building real connection, but also being a leader and helping people feel more like they're a team, more like they're a cohesive unit, instead of feeling rather like they're a bunch of individuals scattered across the fruited plain. What say you on that?
Okay. So when you're thinking about being part of a team, this is the question of culture. And this is the reason why many, many leaders are trying to get their people back into the office. They want this sort of nebulous culture. And the same reason that many men are thinking, how can a third of all remote workers have established a romance remotely? This can only work in person, right? And so what's missing among many, many leaders and many men in general is this understanding that connection can be mediated by technology effectively if you don't have that functional fixedness and that status quo bias. And the way to do so is to create native virtual activities that would bond people as a team. So we're talking about something bigger than yourself. There are many activities that do this. One of the great activities that I describe in the book for working is called virtual co-working, where you and other people on your team, let's say you're a 6 to 8 people team, you get together on a Zoom call, you all dial in for an hour each day, and you're intending to work on your individual tasks during that hour, not collaborate with people, not talk to people. Just leave your window screen open. You start by saying everyone takes 30 seconds to say what they're going to work on, and then you leave your Zoom open. You turn off your microphone, you leave your video, you can turn it off or on, whatever you choose, you leave your speakers on, and then just work on your individual tasks. Then, once somebody has a question, it's usually going to be a more junior member of the team as they're doing their work. They can have a question and a more senior member of the team would answer it, and you could have a little chat, maybe some screen sharing, and then you turn off your microphones and go on to do your work until you have another question. So this is a virtual co-working session. And then you end by, after an hour, everyone shares what they accomplished, and you get off the Zoom meeting. This is a very connecting activity. So people feel more connected with each other, knowing that they work together. Maybe there wasn't any conversation at all, but you know what other people worked on, and you know that they finished. You know that you're motivated by that. So it's a very motivating activity. It's a very connecting activity, and it's an activity that's especially helpful for junior team members to get integrated into the team. So having that team bonding. So that's just one example out of many activities that are well fit for a native virtual format that you can use to help people bond together. And you can think about doing these things in your romantic experience as well. If you and your dating partner, you can have that co-working session together when you're doing some work and she's doing some work, and you just have that Zoom screen on, Zoom video on, and then you can chat briefly about something so that you're present in each other's lives without actually being there in person. And there are many, many creative activities like this that are going to be connecting, that are going to be help you have good bonds with each other. And I talk about them in my book, how you can connect to other people virtually and create that sense of community and belonging. But you need to be creative about it. You can't fall into that functional fixedness. You need to focus on what would be meaningful to people and how you can create those bonds in virtual formats.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I got to tell you, Gleb, I'm so glad that you've applied your knowledge and expertise to this particular topic, because not enough people have probably even noticed it's really happening, let alone have the wherewithal to talk about it. So, man, what a fascinating topic. And I'd be willing to bet that in the men's dating advice world, this topic hasn't been covered anywhere else. So how about that, guys? Gleb's book can be found at the top of my Amazon influencer queue, which is at www.mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon. And this time, even though you can still definitely go to mountaintoppodcast.com/Gleb and pick up a copy of Dr. Sapersky's wonderful book, The Blind Spots Between Us. This time I've got another URL to throw at you. That's mountaintoppodcast.com/hybrid. You can learn much more about Dr. Gleb Sapersky's book, Leading Hybrid and Remote Teams, and also learn more about Dr. Gleb Sapersky and what else he's got going on that will be of interest to you. So once again, Gleb, great conversation. You hit it out of the park, man, and I'm always happy and excited to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And it was really good to bring this information to men who I think are really not aware sufficiently of how the dating world, as well as the work world, will be increasingly intermediated by technology. Many people want to go back to the past, and you're not going to go back to the past. So just go to the future, and you'll be much better off if you do.
Well, I think there are new realizations to be had there and new habits to be formed there that will serve us well going forward into the future, regardless of the venue. So yeah, man, fantastic. I think this has just been incredibly valuable. And gentlemen, please also visit mountaintoppodcast.com. Hey, we're already well into 2023. My question to you is, have you met the right woman? Do you have her in your life? If you have a great woman in your life, how's that going? If you'd like to talk about it, the first 25 minutes is free. Sign up, get on my calendar by going to mountaintoppodcast.com. Also check out our sponsors, Jocko Willink's company, Origin in Maine, Hero Soap, and Keyport. All of our sponsors have fantastic products. You can jump off to each of their respective websites at mountaintoppodcast.com as well. And when you do, please use the coupon code MOUNTAIN10 for an additional 10% off. And until I talk to you again real soon, this is Scott McKay from X&Y Communications in San Antonio, Texas. Be good out there.
The Mountaintop Podcast is produced by X&Y Communications. All rights reserved worldwide. Be sure to visit www.mountaintoppodcast.com for show notes. And while you're there, sign up for the free X&Y Communications newsletter for men. This is Ed Roy Odom speaking for the Mountaintop Podcast.